VLAC is an organization with a mandate of sharing a deeper understanding of Latin American arts. We are located here in Vancouver. Our end goal is to be the managers of an arts facility, a center for Latin American arts here in town. And we are preparing for that. While we don't have our own space, we have the visual space. And so we meet here on Zoom. This is our first art talk of the year. We did one art event with Jairo at the end of last year that was really great. And so we figured that we would bring Jairo, who has quite a bit of experience with Latin American arts, contemporary arts mainly, and to say a few words about Jairo. Jairo has an MA in art history from the University of North Texas. He lived in the US for a while. And his background includes teaching modern, contemporary, and Latin American art history courses in Colombia, in the United States. And currently he's a teacher here in Canada at the Coquitlam College. And he also collaborates as a guest lecturer for Mobile Art School. Sorry. His academic research is devoted to issues related to the dialogues between war, catastrophe, and trauma in contemporary art. And so he's the right guy for the pandemic times. So we want to start the evening by acknowledging that we are Zooming in. You might be somewhere else. Sometimes we even have people attending from other countries. But we are Zooming in from Vancouver, which is the unceded and ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So we are already, a few things just so you know, this meeting is going through 8 p.m. This is a series of talks, and so the first of a series. These are going to be monthly meetings. The next meeting is already scheduled for next month. I'm going to put the link for you guys in the chat. Also, by registering for this event, you are joining our newsletter. Of course, you can unsubscribe at any point, but it's a great way for you to keep in touch with what we are doing. We like these events to be very living room kind of style, so feel free to turn on your cameras if you feel comfortable with that. If you don't, that's fine as well. But we like interaction, so if you want to ask questions during the meeting, feel free to raise your hand. There is the little virtual hand that you can do on Zoom, but you can also just, and if Jairo doesn't see it, I will be also keeping an eye. You can also post your questions on the chat, and I'll make sure to relay the questions to Jairo. I'm going to launch a little poll in a few minutes. I just want a little bit more people to come in. It's just like a 1 minute thing, just so you mark from how you learn about this event. Starting on next month, on the next art talk, we are going to introduce this a little breakout room activity where people are going to be put in pairs just for like 5 minutes to answer a question and to have a little bit more of interactive connection between you guys. So that's it for my announcements. I will keep up. Another thing that I think is important to say is that to keep these events free, we would really appreciate donations. We make the events free so you don't have to go through the barrier of, you know, having to pull out your credit card, etc. And sometimes people don't have a credit card. But if you feel like donating, maybe like $2, $5, $10, $15, whatever you feel comfortable with, use this link that I put on the chat, and you can make a small donation to make sure that we can keep paying instructors, facilitators. We pay following the CARFAC fees, which means fees that are established for artists in the province. And so we try to make sure that everybody is well paid. And so help us keep the arts alive in town. And so that would be much appreciated. So thank you all, and over to you, Jairo.
Okay, I was muted. Good evening, everyone. How are you all doing tonight? Beautiful evening here in British Columbia. It was a really nice sunset. I don't know if you were able to see it, but
I'm not
I
hearing
am.
you, Jairo.
Sorry.
Are you guys? You are?
Uh,
Maybe the problem is mine.
Yeah, I can hear fine.
Okay.
okay, so should I continue or? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to start sharing a screen with you guys. Let me just set up my PowerPoint. For some reason, it's not here. Okay, got it. There you go. Can you all see my screen? Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you for the Vancouver Latin American Cultural Center for giving me this opportunity to talk about something that has a history, has a background history. So I will try to share it with you. This started as an experience that I had in the United States as a Colombian myself. I was born in Colombia. For those of you who know me, if you didn't know, well, I was born in Bogota, in Colombia. And there was a strong conviction amongst my colleagues that I was a Latin Americanist just because I was born and raised in Latin America. I attended the University of North Texas. I attended grad school in North Texas. That's where I decided to pursue my studies in art history. And while I was working with my supervisor for a theme, a topic, a theme for my thesis, turns out that she recommended me the work of a Colombian artist, Doris Salcedo. So without realizing it, I ended up discussing the work of a Colombian artist. And without realizing it, eventually I became a Latin Americanist. To the extent that I stated a thesis statement trying to prove by any means that Shibboleth, the piece that you are looking at right now, was inspired by the intricate geography and the violent events and realities that Doris Salcedo had faced throughout her life as a Colombian citizen. And this, how dare of myself, despite the multiple explanations provided by the artist herself, describing her piece as an allegorical materialization of the means modern societies in Europe have created physical and symbolic barriers for migrants. You know, in her own words, she said something along the lines of, I want to disturb the appearance of the turbine hall in the Tate Modern, in the same way the appearance of immigrants disturbs the consensus and homogeneity of European societies and such and such. And this was my thesis. You know, I thought, no way. I know that you are acknowledging and explaining your piece based on European migrations. But to me, your piece definitely speaks of your experiences as a Colombian. The formal elements and the symbolic elements allude to terrorism, to geography, nature, blah, blah, blah. And in 2018, this is 8 years after my master's thesis, I taught a course in Latin American art. And this is how I got in contact with the texts by three of, to me, the most influential Latin Americanist scholars that are currently in the region. Gerardo Mosquera, Cuban-born writer, Ticio Escobar, a Paraguayan man, and my favorite amongst all of them, Nestor Garcia Canclini from Argentina. They all share a critical but revealing perspective on what Latin America means today in a hyper-connected, globalized world. And they also discuss what the experience of being a Latin American means for us and for the rest of the world. So before we continue, I wanted to read an excerpt of the lyrics of a couple songs very popular in Latin America. Of course, there is a a huge generational break between one and the other. I was raised and I grew up with the Los Prisioneros from Chile, and Calle 13 is more, it's not my cup of tea, but it's all right. So let's compare them. I have the translation on the right in case you are not a Spanish speaker. And I'm going to read it in Spanish, of course, because that's the original language of the song. I open quote. Soy lo que dejaron. Soy toda la sobra de lo que te robaron. Un pueblo escondido en la cima. Mi piel es de cuero, por eso aguanta cualquier clima. Soy la fotografía de un desaparecido. La sangre dentro de tus venas. Soy un pedazo de tierra que vale la pena. Soy una canasta con frijoles. Soy Maradona contra Inglaterra, anotándote 2 goles. Soy lo que sostiene mi bandera. La espina dorsal del planeta es mi cordillera. Soy lo que me enseñó mi padre. El que no quiere a su patria, no quiere a su madre. Soy Latinoamérica, un pueblo sin piernas, pero que camina. End of quote. And the song, this is from 2005, 2006, I believe. And the song from Los Prisioneros reads as follows. This is just a fragment of the song. I open quote. Para turistas, gente curiosa, es un sitio exótico para visitar. Es solo un lugar económico, pero inadecuado para habitar. Nadie en el resto del planeta toma en serio a este inmenso pueblo lleno de tristeza. Se sonríen cuando ven que tienen 20 y tantas banderitas, cada cual más orgullosa que su soberanía. ¡Qué tontería! Dividir es debilitar. Para que se sientan en familia, copiamos sus barrios y su estilo de vida. We try to talk in the jet set lengua para que nos crean incivilizados. Somos un pueblito tan simpático que todos nos ayudan si se trata de un conflicto armado. Pero esa misma cantidad de oro la podrían dar para encontrar la solución definitiva al hambre. Latinoamérica es grande, debe aprender a decidir. Very contrasting lyrics, one and the other. One is speaking of pride, the other speaking about inferiority complex. So here's my question for you to start with. I have my own thesis, but I wonder if you want to share with me what you understand by Latin American art. All right, we have some comments on the chat. Calle 13, that's reggaeton, right? Yeah, they are like the godfathers of reggaeton, as far as I'm concerned. Yvonne says, yeah, it's a mix of reggaeton and other Latin rhythms like cumbia. That song's video is amazing. Yeah, but anyway, let's do the homework. What do you understand about Latin American art?
So should we unmute ourselves for this?
Absolutely, yes.
I guess already there's this like geographical attachment, right? I mean, at least that's with this question, like it makes me think about the geography and art made in Latin American or by Latin Americans.
Right. That's the main definition, like the most basic way of looking at it. We are Latin American because we share the same land, right? So Latin American art refers to a type of art that comes from the same soil, that comes from the same area, the same continent. We share the same continent. So we are Latin American, and we can speak of Latin American art because it comes from that particular area. Anything else? I think we have a comment on the chat too. Yeah, Michelle, that's what I think too. Made by Latin Americans. Oh, but hold on, Michelle. We have then another definition, because Miret is talking about geography. So Latin American art is art made in Latin America, art from Latin America. But Michelle is also talking about an art that is created or produced by Latin Americans, regardless of where we are, regardless of our location. Ari de la Mora says, for me, from the painter's perspective, it is what gives us our identity, or I'm not sure what you mean, but I guess it has something to do with something that you bring with you, regardless of territory. Latin America is a feeling kind of similar to what the Calle 13 song suggests, right? So I have some introductory thesis, and this is what I will use for some of the images that I will discuss. I will try to go through all of them. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to speak or to talk about all of them in detail. I want to use them more as an illustration as opposed to an actual art historical analysis, even though my art historian practice sometimes compels me to go way into detail. But I will try to be synthetic, even though sometimes that's hard. So we talk about territory, right? If we stick to that definition, we must say that Latin American art refers to an art produced by artists living in Latin American countries. So if you were born in a non-Latin American country, but you have lived more than half of your entire life in a Latin American country, could you also create Latin American art? And we also say, you also said, this sort of like coincided with my thesis, Latin American art is art produced in Latin American soil. So the only requirement based on that thesis, based on that idea, is that in order to be a Latin American artist, we must have been born and raised in a Latin American country. Now, I apologize here, it should be number 2, but anyway, doesn't matter. We share similar memories. We have a colonial past and a similar historicist project, right? The independencia and the establishment of the democratic republics. So Latin American art is an art referencing national values tied to a specific territory. It's an art that celebrates national pride, national identity to promote and disseminate a collective feeling and a bonding sense of belonging, a national pride. We're proud to be Latin American, okay? And we go along that idea of promoting that sense of belonging, that sense of of pride. We could also define Latin American art in terms of theme or in terms of artistic individual interest. So we can say any art that speaks about Latin American realities. If we understand it under that lens, we will kind of be accepting that anybody is capable of creating Latin American art. Anybody could potentially be Latin American or a Latin American artist insofar as its subject matter incorporates Latin American realities. So as long as your discursive practices incorporate issues relevant to Latin America, you could be considered a Latin American artist. Now things are getting interesting. Or we could also say art produced by artists born in Latin American soil or who have embraced all the Latin American experience and integrate those experiences in their themes, in their topics, in their subject matter, regardless of where they are, regardless of current geographic locations, education, background, or external circumstances. Finally, we could also discuss stylistic issues. So Latin American art is an art produced in a Latin American style because we have our own style. So the material aspect of the work stands away from colonial imperialist Eurocentric imaginaries or realities, expectations. What makes Latin American art different from that of the rest of the world?
Jairo, there is one more comment on the chat.
Yeah, this may have been covered in the first 15-ish minutes, but was there any dialogue as to whether Latin American art will only be considered Latin American if they are indigenous to Latin America? There is a similar conversation going on in Canada about what constitutes as indigenous art. That's where we're going next, because it's a huge debate. Apparently, when we try to define Latin American art based on the idea of nation or state, we tend to believe that Latin American art is only the type of expression that hasn't been contaminated or affected by any external influences. That is not, as we say in Spanish, extranjerizante, with a foreign orientation. Here's the thing. Here's the first case. I wrote it as case 0. We all come from countries that were former colonies. How can we create, after the independence of our nations, a collective, cohesive image, how to consolidate a visual language without falling into a formula that replicates or emulates colonial practices? So the way we got to oil painting, the way we got to the principle of representation was through our colonial past. So it's interesting to see that discrepancy between context, theme, and style. We tried as Latin Americans to adapt a style that did not belong to us. And ironically, paradoxically, we were independent in the sense of nation, but we were not independent in the sense of artistic approaches. What a paradox. So Felipe Santiago Gutierrez, a criollo, a Mexican-born artist, visualized native subjects. And this goes along with the comment. That's why this is good timing Anna, you got at the perfect time, because this type of depictions are depictions that apply or that use academic principles and aesthetic standards on beauty, posing, and all the academic rules coming from European tradition. Chiaroscuro, impasto, outline, contour, idealization of the figure, and even a little bit of whitening of the figure too, by fixing the nose, by fixing the skin a little bit, emulating poses that could be seen in European, in this case, Baroque or neoclassical art. Is kind of like emulating this type of styles. How to achieve an image for these emerging nations by artistic means? Why keeping academic rules? We have a pre-Columbian past, right? So why not look at it? The Coatlicue statue was discovered on August 13, 1790, at the Plaza del Zócalo in Mexico City. It's made of a type of stone known as andesite. I've never heard of that before, but that's the label that I found. Turns out that they had to bury it again for a long period of time. And turns out that Saturnino Herrán in 1914 took the Coatlicue and reframed it to create what he titled as La Coatlicue Transformada. So we see these first stages of cultural syncretism. Syncretism, it's, I don't even know how to define it properly. Maybe some of you can help me, but syncretism is like a blending of cultures, like a convergence of cultures through processes like mestizaje, among others. So Saturnino Herrán took the Coatlicue and inserted some elements to westernize the figure. So as opposed to being the Aztec god or goddess, the Coatlicue became a Christian symbol. It's not pagan anymore. So it's washing off, now that it's fashionable to speak about washing your hands, it's washing off the pre-Hispanic connotation and symbolic charge attached to that sculpture. The woman, the Coatlicue, became a man, became God. The serpent became God. Life became death. The mother became the son, or the father, if you want to look at it under the perspective of God. The devil, the evil forces of nature became hope, redemption, salvation. The spiritual became terrenal. And the pre-Hispanic or pre-colonial became a new image for the Republic, but that was still mediated by the European past, to the extent that there was an argument, or not an argument, I'm thinking in Spanish here, a justification, a reason as to why the Coatlicue was buried again. Translation on the right, original on the left. This was a letter written by the priest Benito Maria Moxo and Francoli in 1805. And I open quote, fue preciso enterrarla, la Coatlicue, otra vez por un motivo que nadie había previsto. Los indios, que miran con tan estúpida indiferencia todos los monumentos de las artes europeas, acudían con inquieta curiosidad a contemplar su famosa estatua. End of quote. So go figure. These were part of the processes of Colonia, Conquista and Colonia that took place in this in our Latin American countries. Now, let's look at the other case. Andrés de Santa Maria. Andrés de Santa Maria was a Colombian painter. He was academically trained in Paris. He spent most of his artistic career in Paris, and he passed away in Belgium, in Brussels. He decided to go back to Colombia. Between 1904 and 1911, he was named as the director of the School of Fine Arts in Bogota. But he was academically trained in Europe. So going back to the thesis, an artist born in a Latin American country, but whose artistic identity did not match the place where he was born. And of course, that artistic identity conflicted, clashed with the expectations of the Colombian middle upper class, of the Colombian art connoisseurs, of the critics. The critics destroyed Andrés de Santa Maria. If we look at his work, he was a pretty good painter. But he was not painting about Colombian realities. As a matter of fact, he knew and he was in close contact with the realists and the impressionists. So what he was doing in his own style was trying to translate those visual languages of the French avant-garde into Colombian contexts. The Gleaners by Millet became the Sabaneras. The luncheon on the voting party became the tea party. Even though we don't drink tea, we are Colombian, we drink coffee. But hey, that's the Santa Maria. The execution of the Emperor Maximilian became Los Fusileros. When he was director of the School of Fine Arts, the critics considered that he was a foreigner. He was not a true Colombian artist. Big paradox for him to be named the director of the Colombian Academy when his formation was of a painter that was influenced by the avant-garde, by modernism, by modern art movements. And modernity represented the complete opposite of what the Colombian public was waiting of him. Of course, he left Colombia. He came back a few years later, around the 1920s. And here we see a great example on how he took, and this happened to many Latin American artists who took the influences of the avant-garde as an artistic style. Big mistake, huge anachronism, because we can understand modernity in Latin America as a rule, as a normative trend, as a fashion. Modernity appeared in Europe as a counter response to a long-held tradition that they had to go against it. So for instance, the loose brushstroke, the fragmented brushstroke, so famous of the Impressionist artists, was intended for European painters to speak of the evanescent, the elusive moment of modern realities, not to paint portraits. Portraits are still, are static. So that's why this type of paintings, this type of artworks did not appeal to the public, to the Colombian public at that period of time. Additionally, we can't pretend that the insertion of a new pictorial language will be immediately assimilated in a context that not only was not ready for it, but also didn't have the tradition or the history or the problems that Europe had to talk about something like modernity. What do we mean by modernity in Latin America? So that's a different discussion. I'm not going to go way too much into it because that will take us another 2 hours. But one thing is to be modern in terms of progress, industrial developments, and so on. A different thing is to be modern in your head. So yes, you can live in a city with trains and with great means of transportation, but if your idiosyncrasy, if your identity, if your way of living is not willing to accept the separation between progress and tradition, you are doomed. And this is exactly what was happening in many places in Latin America. Perhaps Pedro Figari did understand the correlation. This is a guy from Uruguay. He did understand the correlation between pictorial style, the autonomy of color, and the topic or the theme that he wanted to incorporate in his compositions. So the colors, the loose brush stroke, all that movement, all those open areas coincide with, they look like they were dancing reggaeton now that we were talking about Calle 13. They are dancing candombe, and candombe has rhythm. Candombe has color. Candombe has fluid movement. So that's just one isolated example of somebody who kind of did assimilate the avant-garde to incorporate it under his own terms, to absorb it or sucked it in. I know that in Brazil, and I didn't bring this example today, something similar happened with Tarsila do Amaral and the anthropophagia movement in the 1920s. Tarsila de Amaral, and what was the other guy? Osvaldo de Andrade, was that correct? Yeah, Osvaldo de Andrade, there you go. Wow, my memory is not so messed up. There you go. COVID, still, I'm doing all right despite the circumstances. And there you go. This is Andrés de Santa Maria's version of Calle 13's song. So, all right, the critics are destroying me. I am not a Colombian artist. I am an extranjerizante. What do I do? Talk about a Colombian hero. Andrés de Santa Maria is old. He's, 1926. He's already in his 50s, I believe. He decides to paint a triptych in a very traditional style of Libertador Simón Bolívar. And what do you have here? Let me see if I can pull out the pen. The Colombian flag. I tell you this, and this is kind of like off topic, but if there is something that I have a lot of trouble with, is pretending that you are a true patriot because you go out to a parade with a flag or with the soccer shirt of your country. If that makes you a patriot, then we are in big trouble because those are simply symbols. But the more you insist upon those symbols, if Colombianism only depends on a flag, it means that our sense of identity is very fragile. And it's a mistake. And this is, again, this is a thesis that I've been working on for a few years. It's a mistake to pretend that to be a true patriot, or to pretend that your identity can only and should only be reduced to the presence of a flag. Have a comment on the chat. It seems that he might have had a cultural identity crisis. Absolutely. Imagine, the guy loved his country. The guy loved Colombia. He was very attached to Colombia. Not for nothing, he accepted to be the director of the academy. But treating him like that just because he was not living in Colombia, calling him a traitor just because he was not painting, he was not painting things that were expected by the public and by the critics in Colombia. It's a pretty interesting discussion. Now, speaking of flags, all right, we could give reason, and we could agree with the critics and say, yeah, we accept your comments, and we accept your discontent. So let's create a national art. So we can understand that indigenism in Mexico, and I will try to be fast with this because there will be another talk on muralismo and indigenism. But just a quick commentary on how indigenism in Mexico and in Latin America was an attitude absorbed by artists as a sort of idealization and tribute fomenting native values. But that element is fundamental for us to understand this better, because it kind of makes us wonder about the interests behind this type of works. It might be a historical interest, an anthropological interest, a cultural interest, a patrimonial interest, or simply an exotic interest. It's interesting to see the first stages in the work of Diego Rivera in a sort of a conflict between representation and abstraction, between the avant-garde and his place of birth, between the local and the global. So he was artistically trained in Paris. He met Picasso. He met Georges Braque. He was part of the Cubist movement, but he couldn't hide, he couldn't avoid incorporating the zarapes and this type of Mexican traditions in his Cubist paintings. Was it necessary? Not sure about that, but it's as though, if any time you create something, you have to incorporate an element from where you come from, that opens another discussion. And especially in the case of Rivera, considering what happened when he came back to Mexico. Yes, Lily?
Couple of comments on the chat.
Oh, I don't know why I didn't see them. Let's see. Agree, not like most expatriates living abroad for any significant amount of time. This is from Ana, speaking of Andres de Santa Maria, the feeling of being a drifter.
Anna was agreeing with Michelle because she said that he probably had a cultural identity crisis.
And there will be like 3 or 4 more examples today of this sort of identity crisis.
Yeah, this feeling of not belonging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A feeling of being neither from here nor there. I'm from here, from there, or from anywhere. And this is something that probably all of us are experiencing nowadays, that we are in the diaspora, that we are in a country that embraced us, that we feel grateful for, but sometimes we feel like we are losing something, you know, and we try to find a meaning for that something. But as I was talking to Lily last year, it seems as though we understand more about our identity when we become outsiders. By outsiders, I mean when we look at things from afar. There are many things that I understand now about Colombianisms that I was not aware of when I was living in Colombia. So that's a discussion that we should probably have at the end, because I do want to talk about that, and particularly about your experiences living overseas, and particularly in my case. And I know Miret, for instance, she has lived in 2 different countries as well. So the experience of living in one or different countries also gives you a different perspective of who you are and of the place where you come from. Sometimes you become more critical, but sometimes you kind of like learn to love, but in a different sense, you know. So you are not this sort of a chauvinistic clown moving the flag everywhere, but you become more attached to a more complex idea of what patriotism means. Going back here, I wanted to look at what happened quickly with Rivera, with Siqueiros, and with Orozco. Do I have Orozco here? No, just Rivera and Siqueiros. When they engaged in this movement of the muralistas. If we look at the Dia de las Flores by Rivera, we kind of see an organized scene, an organized space. We're not focusing that much on the presence of the indigenous per se, as what happened with the first painting that we saw by Gutierrez. But we're looking at a stylization of the native, which is problematic. First, because you're trying to rationalize, you are trying to organize something under the basis of the rationalist and the plastic principles of the avant-garde. In other words, you are trying to organize or place, give a site to the other so that the European eye can feel pleased. And something that is problematic about the muralistas, but particularly about the social realist movement that came after the muralismo, is the portrayal of indigenous communities as mob, as mass, repeated patterns of people with the same shape, with the same hats. So they become sort of like a number, you know, repeated patterns of people, erasing with that rhythmic, repetitive pattern any trace of individual identity, placing them instead as the same archetypical worker. And the final problem with creating a national art is that you are reducing the practice of artists and validating the practice of artists only insofar as it responds to the expectations of a national spirit that is attached to a political feeling. This is a big lesson that was left by Kazimir Malevich, the Russian supremacist artist in the Soviet Union, when he denied the option of becoming a constructivist. And he said, be careful. Be careful, because art and the state can never go along. If you as an artist go along with the state, eventually you lose the option of going against the government, of criticizing, of questioning. Art should never get along with politics in a pleasing sense. Art should be to denounce and to question and to not necessarily agree with anything political that goes on. And I think that that was a problem of the muralistas and the indigenistas. But to me, that was a necessary step. That was needed. Going back to the roots, all right, we are Latin American artists because we have an indigenous past, and everything that artists in Latin America do must correspond to that indigenous past. That is great, but that was our classicism. At that point in time, my theory is that we found our classicism, and it was necessary to go against that indigenous trend to find a kind of sense of modernity in our practices. Now, this is what we were talking about with Lily and with the comments on the chat. The case of Diego Rivera, even Andres de Santa Maria, I believe Tarsila also lived in Europe for a period of time, is not explored under the lenses of what Frida Kahlo does, and is the identity crisis. Frida Kahlo, wife of Diego Rivera, she does question that. And I'm not going to talk here about the Hollywoodesque figure of Frida as this woman who suffered and all that. What I want to focus here mainly and mostly is on her perspective as somebody with a Mexican heritage, a German heritage, living in between, in a liminal space. Liminal means in an in-between space between Mexico and the United States. This is a period where Diego Rivera is receiving some commissions from the Rockefellers in the US. So Frida is playing with this duality of the sun and the moon, life and darkness. Her duality as an individual, as a woman, as a Mexican, as a German, as a mother, even though she was not a mother as far as I'm concerned, she went through a lot of miscarriages, as a lover, as an artist. So that element of crisis is explored here by dividing all the traditions from her native Mexico, mostly pre-Columbian traditions, and all this idea of going back to the earth, the basics, the soil that brings life to her. But in this case, the other hand, the other side, the American side, is artificial. So what brings life to the American tradition are not roots and plants and vegetables and flowers, but wires, circuits, electricity, light bulbs, and factories that produce smoke and are the symbol of this already emerging and powerful country where capitalism is the rule. Of course, this is the emblem of Frida. I don't know if anybody has anything to say about this painting of the two Fridas, las dos Fridas. say no more. I just find it curious that there is only one point of connection or 2 points of connection between the two Fridas. One is the German Frida, the other is the Mexican Frida with the Tijuana dress. The point of connection are the blood vessels on the heart. That's the only element that is shared in common, because the hands, yes, they are holding hands, but each Frida has her own hands or their own hands. But here, I've always been curious as to why she cuts the blood vessel. She cuts the vein. What's the deal with that? It seems to me, and you can participate, of course. Oh, there you go. We have comment here. I can definitely identify to this painting, says Miret. I don't know if you want to add something, Miret.
Yes, there's that duality in this painting that I think a lot of us that migrate feel in this in-between place, or this kind of, you know, what am I? Am I this, do I have this Mexican roots, or am I becoming a little bit more, I don't know, European when you're living in, I don't know, Europe or Canadian? I feel a lot there. And those scissors or whatever that tool is, I always wondered if she's holding it or if she's cutting it, because they look, to me, they look like flat, like those flat, I don't know what they're called, that you use in the hospital. They can hold the vein. They're like flat scissors. I don't know what these are called, I think.
Oh, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Yeah, they have like an edge that is kind of like in an angle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they are like tweezers, right? And they put them to hold a vein, or
I think it's called clamp.
it's a clamp.
Like, yeah. Well, that's what Grey's Anatomy says. I think it's a tool for clamping. But that's very interesting. I never saw it that way, that she could be doing that.
It also makes me think of a process that has been cut in half. I mean, if I look back in time, in my personal experience, back in 2005, the first time that I fled out of Colombia to the United States, I was a different person. And leaving Colombia was traumatic. I left about a lot of stuff that I used to do, that I used to be like, you know. What is in Mexican's Frida's hand? It's a miniature portrait of Diego Rivera. You know that she was obsessed with Diego Rivera. He was a womanizer. He was terrible, but still she loved him. Ari, you're raising your hand.
Yes, hi. Just regarding this painting, those Fridas, it's actually funny because I remember the first time that I saw that specific painting. It was in the Museo de Arte Moderno in Mexico City, and I went there with a school group. It was a school trip, and I remember when I saw that painting, I was completely blown away, and I had no idea who Frida Kahlo was or anything. And it was just that connection that had, and it made me realize how something that somebody painted years and years ago has that power to connect with me. That's magic. It was like magic for me. And then time passed, and then I became an immigrant myself, and I realized how that painting it still speaks to me. It still talks about. It feels like it's talking about my story. And regarding why she's cutting the vein, what I have read is when Frida painted that painting, it was in the process when she was divorcing Diego Rivera. And because Diego Rivera was so in love with this Mexican traditional Frida, like if you see in the painting, she's holding a small portrait of Diego Rivera when she's wearing this Tijuana dress. And then this is this vein that is connected to the European Frida. it's like a symbolism that she caught her her relationship. She didn't, but it's like a symbol that she caught her relationship with Diego, and with the Diego that was in love with the Mexican Frida. So the Frida that was able to cut that relationship was the European Frida. So that's what I read somewhere, and it made total sense to me. But just regarding that painting, it was funny that you guys mentioned it because it was just my painting.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for your comment.
Thank you.
It's also interesting now that while I was listening you talk, it's important also to consider this heart that is sort of like caught in a like a C-section, you know, in a half, you know, and this heart is complete. So the image of the Mexican Frida, the Tijuana dress Frida, is more aestheticized, whereas the modern European Frida appears to be, you know, dying in her own blood, you know, sort of losing blood, and she's about to collapse. And everything that is going wrong in her life is in the German side, in the European side. Everything that seems to be working well, functioning, is in the Mexican side. That's also quite interesting. Couple more comments. Yeah, interesting, because if we see the artery vein is also connected to Diego's, says Anna, the cold and unfeeling European side versus the warm and passionate Mexican side. Exactly. Europeans are considered cold compared to most Latin American cultures. Yes, I hope we still have time to talk about those concepts of Latinos as being warm and all that, and Europeans as being cold, but let's see if we still have time. Before I move on, long story short, because of this painting, André Breton, the founder, the megalomaniac, the machist leader of the surrealist movement, gets in contact with Frida Kahlo, and Breton basically touches Frida and says, "You are a true surrealist," like a messianic, like a messiah type of attitude. "You're a true surrealist." To what Frida Kahlo says, "Thanks, but no." Just because something resembles an avant-garde movement or an avant-garde expression from Europe doesn't mean that everything that Latin American artists do must go in comparison to the European counterpart. Even though sometimes those resonances are unavoidable, we also have to say, and that's why I bring this in this section, Roberto Mata, Wilfredo Lam, and Julia Kosish with Digiland. They were a couple. I bring them because they sort of like overcome the national and territorial identity. With Roberto Mata was Chilean, but he was not interested in being stereotyped or categorized as a Chilean artist. He was an artist, and he was highly influential in some avant-garde movements in Europe. Wilfredo Lam, we don't know where he is from. Wilfredo Lam was born in La Habana. His father was Chinese. His mother was Afro-Cuban. So he was a mixture of many things. And in his head, he didn't perceive himself as a Latino. He didn't perceive himself as a Chinese. He didn't perceive himself as an African. He was a result of that syncretism that went through his veins. And Julia Kosish and Digiland, his wife, created a type of art that did not depend on representation, that defied convention, that was more indexical or abstract rather than representational. And that way, by avoiding what the muralists and the social realists did, they are opening the scope for more possibilities that don't depend on this principle that Latin America is only a face, that Latin America is an indigenous, that Latin America is such and such. This is from 1946 and looks as if it was created in the 1970s, looks very conceptual. So sometimes when we tend to believe, oh, the Latin American artists were influenced by European, it's the other way around. There are now documents that suggest that Roberto Mata was one of the main influences for Jackson Pollock and Ashley Gorky, in the same way as Joaquin Torres Garcia apparently left a big trace for what happened later in Europe with the neoplasticist movements. So that's another way of reconsidering the history, not only the history of Latin American art, but the history of modern art as a whole. And I'm getting close to the end. I want to mention here a quote by Ticio Escobar to speak about our current present. And I open quote because this talks about a category that they, Ticio Escobar, Garcia Canclini, and Gerardo Mosquera invented, known as the glocal. Glocal is like a mixture of the global and the local. And tardo moderno, I don't even know how to translate that. It's like a late modernity. We are late moderns, those living in Latin America. Modernity arrived to us by different means. I open quote, when globalization, supported by the transnational dispersion of the epicenters of power, promotes the abandonment of the discourses on territory, then the metaphors of center is the power, the dominant power, and periphery, Latin Americans are part of the periphery, the metaphors of center and periphery cease to be relevant anymore. That's why Latin American art is today framed under a confusing space intertwined with tradition and modernity, inhabited by its own memories and foreign dreams. What do you find interesting about this map? This is the official map by the UNESCO of the World Heritage Sites. What do you find interesting?
Everything is in Europe.
Exactly. So the places that, according to the UNESCO, are considered patrimonial, the memory that is worth preserving is the memory of Western Europe. And few of the places that you find across North, Central, and South America are places, most of them, Cartagena, Mompox, I believe there is some place in, I don't know if it is Mexico City or Oaxaca. Those places that are considered patrimony that are not in Europe are patrimonial because they either are part of a colonial past or because they fulfill the exotic fantasies, the fantasies on exoticism of European settlers. So yes, now Latin American artists are not condemned to express the unique, truthful experiences of the territory. They can be international without renegating their peripheric position. But the grouping and the notion of a universal culture has ended up, in many ways, in a renewed form of cultural colonization. So this new cultural colonization doesn't take place through the invasion of foreign lands, but from the systematic consolidation and dissemination of manufacture, processes of manufacture, distribution, and consumption of experiences sold and offered as commodities. I apologize that I forgot to translate that quote, but it's all right. So now what we call patrimony somehow becomes like a place that we can purchase, like a supermarket, and we can go to that supermarket and consume the world. Globalization was poured over us as a totalitarian, presumptively equalitarian project whose purpose was not really to blur difference, but to impede dissent, dissensus, through the flattening of taste, style, tendencies, etc. So by speaking of lo Latino, we are erasing local memories. And we are assuming that all of us, the Latinos, think, act, feel, and have experiences or have experienced things in a similar way. So the discourse of difference has been replaced by multiculturalism, a concept that ignites the view of the world as a big supermarket. And the notion of the other has been tampered under the pleasing but complex narrative of tolerance. So I'm not suggesting that there is anything wrong with feeling proud for being Latino, but we got to be careful and understand that being Latin American is something not only to be proud of, but also to be skeptical, so that we don't fall into the gap of self-victimizing ourselves or self-stereotyping where we come from, if that makes any sense. Which is why it's so important what this other trend of artists started creating in the 1970s and 1960s, such as Antonio Caro or Leon Ferrari, using recognizable symbols to turn them upside down and question something that we still suffer from and it's impossible to get rid of, which is cultural dependency. Even though that cultural dependency doesn't always come in the shape of a choice. It's not that we chose to drink Coca-Cola when we were kids. It's just that that's what was around. That was the cheapest option. So that cultural invasion is something that we grew up with, but it is up to us to eat it as a whole or to sort of absorb it and twist it around. So the piece by Caro, the Colombia, I love it because it's a way of saying, yes, we have been exploited historically by foreign lands, and that's the reality. And we became a brand, and Colombia is a brand that is exploited for coffee, for crops, and there is nothing wrong with accepting that reality. So the absurdity of thinking of a unique Latin America in the midst of globalization is made evident by these artists, Narino Ospina, such as Narino Ospina, mocking our obsession with a unique Latin American style. And also mocking the tendency to think the authentic as the pre-Hispanic and the ghettoism proper of former pseudo-modernist movements into neglecting any foreign influences into the practices of Latin American artists. It's interesting to see somebody like Diego Rivera so invested into the muralist and the social realist project when he was formed, and that way of thinking wouldn't have been possible if it weren't by his previous formation as an European, as an artist who was educated in Europe, as a Mexican living in Europe. And just to finish the conversation, well, at least my part, I know that we still have a little bit of time because we started around 6:10, 6:15, I believe. We started at 6:40, I believe. The case of Gabriel Orozco is so interesting. I want to quote Nestor Garcia Canclini when he speaks of what happens with artists such as Gabriel Orozco, or even something that I experienced, and I wish he was here tonight. Probably he will watch a recap if he has the chance. I will be back to this in a minute. Carlos Collin. This actually, I discussed about this with Carlos, which is tokenization or tokenism. I open quote by Nestor Garcia Canclini. He says, while the production of artists from the center, rated as European, North American artists, has been historically interpreted as great aesthetic achievements, the production of African, Asian, Oceanic, or Latin American artists has had the tendency to be interpreted and discussed as visual culture, popular culture, or cultural patrimony. End of quote. So the case of Gabriel Orozco is that art critics, texts usually read his work in a similar way as what I did with Doris Salcedo. Oh, Gabriel Orozco is Mexican, so the Calavera Catrina, of course. He has a skull. He's talking about his experiences as a Mexican with death. Critics always try to find out correlations between his work and the geographic, ethnic, and anthropological connections with Mexico. Connect everything, that he does with his Mexican past, with Mexican tradition, with popular folklore. Oops, sorry. Even there is a critique that I found by an art critic, last name Fisher, and he says, I open quote, we can see an intimate connection between sex and violence that alludes to the traumas left by the catastrophic processes of the Conquista and the Colonia in his native Mexico. And of course, Gabriel Orozco reads about this and he laughs. He says, I'm Mexican, boy. I'm talking about the universal truths behind death. Don't tokenize me and don't say that it's just because I am Mexican and that these objects are exotic or are part of the mercados, because that's not entirely true. Some of those objects were picked up in other remote areas in Europe or even in the US or in Africa during those trips that he took as an activist too, as an environmental activist that he is. One of my favorite pieces, and I think I have a couple more images before we go. So James Luna, half Indian, half Mexican. Who is he? And he is in between. This is the greatest example of liminal space, of liminality. So before the 1840s, Mexican Americans, what they call them now as Mexican Americans, were already on US territory. So this means that not all Mexican Americans are immigrants or aliens, to use the language of a former leader that we don't need to talk about. James Luna used to say, we didn't cross the border crossed us. So he has a Mexican father and a Native American mother. But every time, all the time, he will be pulled over by the cops, and they will require him for his ID. And sometimes in the tickets, they will write down race or ethnicity, Native American, ethnicity, Latino, Hispanic, ethnicity, Mexican. So he decided to make a joke about that. He took mock shots, half of the mock shot as a stereotypical Native American, a stereotypical Mexican, and this is what he is. Who are we? Aliens, yeah, Anna Blacklish is such a dehumanizing terms. Aliens, you know, it feels like the Ridley Scott movie. Ari de la Mora, regarding contemporary Mexican women painters, check the work of Rocio Caballero and Paulina James or Jaimes. I will check it out, definitely. Thank you for the recommendation. And James Luna, this guy is lovely. This guy is awesome. He remade the piece in 2010. So this is him a few years later. Same principle, same idea. How to face and overcome an inferiority complex and a type of condescendence that is self-induced, you know, assuming that all Latin Americans are poor, that are always facing challenges, are always going against the current, that our achievements are not individual but national. You know, I don't know if you've ever been familiar with this newspaper headlines that say 5 Brazilians who are successful in such and such, 5 Colombians who are the best at this is a great achievement of Colombia for Colombians, because, you know, and it seems as though every type of achievement by Latinos has to be coined under nationalistic terms. We should instead consider a definition that discusses art from Latin America, or art that engages with Latin America, not necessarily a nationalistic approach to Latin American art. And I wanted to end with this piece that I experienced from our dear Carlos Collin. I know some of you have met him personally. Highly talented guy. And he presented this compelling piece at the Rich Gallery in Abbotsford this is 2019, May 2019. So he wanted to talk about his experiences in the Canadian diaspora, but also the experiences of Mexican workers in the Canadian diaspora. Workers that come as part of the seasonal agricultural worker program, I believe that's the name, seasonal agricultural worker program. Mexican workers that come, thousands of Mexican workers that come every year to work on Canadian farms. And he incorporated in the installation the hats that speak of this. I love this hat with the Canadian flag worn by a Mexican worker, or the ornaments that you will find on the festivities, or the foods that you will find in the supermarkets. And I remember discussing with Carlos how some of the attendees to the exhibition were looking at this under those lenses that were criticized by Nestor Garcia Canclini. Oh, you know, this looks cute. This is so Mexican. You know, I heard somebody saying this looks so Mexican. And yes, it looks Mexican, but that is not the point. That's not the point that Carlos was trying to raise. Even there was a letter with a manifesto from the workers asking for better working conditions and all that, which is why within the festivities, you find words such as justice, resistance, and dignity, land, and something else. So it's not a pleasing work in the sense of, it's not simply celebrating Mexican culture as what the European mind wants to see of Mexican culture. It's also subtly denouncing a reality and dignifying the presence of these workers through these experiences in the diaspora. I want to finish with this quote by Garcia. I didn't translate it. I apologize for that. But it says, aunque no aspiremos ya a que el arte nos devuelva la imagen de la sociedad, ese tercer nombre designa el lugar donde nos interrogamos sobre lo que somos. Si sigue habiendo arte dentro de la cultura visual, es porque en él se recrea una y otra vez esta posibilidad de nombrar lo inminente, el vértigo del que va a mirarse en un dudoso espejo. La cultura visual de este fin de siglo clausuró las respuestas dogmáticas que pretendían encontrar la identidad ya lista en la raza, en la identificación con un territorio o una historia monumentalizada, en colecciones de objetos folclóricos o en la subjetividad de algunos individuos excepcionalmente creadores. Pero no suprimió la pregunta por la identidad de los individuos, de los pueblos y del propio arte. No conozco otro lugar donde esto se diga mejor que en el poema Traducirse de Ferreira Goulart. That I didn't bring, unfortunately, but I should have. I wish I have had the time to discuss Guadalupe's piece, but I wanted to leave you with this image. An Argentinian-born artist living in Vancouver, performer. You also know, some of you know her. What is a flag? What is a country? What is an identity? What does land mean and what does Latin America mean? That's all I have to say on my part. I know we have about...
Yeah, I want to give a shout out to those two artists because we had both Carlos Colin and Guadalupe Martinez on our studio visits. So for whoever haven't done one of this, we have a series of studio visits that we actually virtually visit the studios of the artists and discuss with them their work. And Carlos Colin and Guadalupe Martinez were part of that series. The studio visits are coming back next month. So keep an eye on those newsletters that we're going to send you to participate in these programs. Next week, we're going to have another Heart Talk with Jairo, plus a studio visit. And if you are interested in visual arts, those are two really great programs to participate in. Jairo, I think we really ran out of time. So thank you so much, Jairo. That was really, I learned a lot. It's really intriguing stuff and a subject that I think we can go on and on. So many examples to talk about and this, even that's this thing that I always talk about because Latin America, it's a concept that's hard to keep, to grab, because it's fluid. It's not a geographic concept only. And so you can see Latin American define Latin American in different ways. And as you said, because we are here and because of we are all part of this, of our own diasporas, we are having a chance of investigating that from afar and from the point of view of our own experiences. So thank you for illuminating that. I look forward to the next Art Talk. I hope to see you guys again. Everybody who's here for the first time, I really invite you to visit our website and learn a little bit more about what we do. And again, if you feel generous, I'm putting again our donation link on the, we try to keep these events for free or on a pay what you can basis. And so if you feel so inclined, you can link there and leave us a donation so we can keep doing what we do. And you'll be helping us share this deeper understanding of Latin American arts and culture.
These are just hypotheses. I mean, I might be, if a Latin Americanist was here, he or she will probably destroy me. And that's absolutely fine. That's exactly why these conversations are necessary. And again, you know, the idea is always to love who we are, to love where we come from, but also to constantly, as you were saying before, question and be in this process
and investigate. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and that's
exactly.
that's part of the riches of coming from a region with so that has so much imagery and so much to share. So I look forward to the next talk. Look forward to seeing you all next time. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight.
I just want to end with, I'm just waiting. Thank you so much for your comments on the chat. I truly appreciate that you enjoyed it. And Michelle says, my favorite quote from tonight, we learn more about our identity when we become outsiders, which reminds me of a phrase by a song, and I'm going to say it in Spanish. And that's all I have to say for tonight. Tenemos que ir tan lejos para estar acá.
Okay, I won't say anything else.
Take care.
So
bye-bye. Good night.
Thank you so very much, everyone. Thank you. See you next time.
Bye.